I was, I was going to be a journalist. Definitely. I was hell-bent on being a journalist, and I had been on my high school newspaper and my college newspaper, and I came to New York 1962 and went to an employment agency, walked in cold on 42nd Street. And the woman said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to be a journalist." And she said, "Well, how would you like to work at Newsweek magazine?" So I said, "Sure." So she picked up the phone and called, sent me over there in my 3-inch heels, which is what you wore in those days. And I had an interview with the 2 people who were in charge of hiring girls. And they hired me as a male girl at Newsweek. And Al Wall said to me, "Why do you want to work at Newsweek?" And I think he expected me to say something about Newsweek and how emotionally something. I don't know. I mean, I had barely ever read Newsweek. And I said, "Well, I want to be a writer." And he said, "Well, women aren't writers at Newsweek." And it's interesting to me because it would never have occurred to me or almost any other woman in the world at that point to say, "How dare you say that," or "Well, you're wrong," or "This is not going to apply to me," or anything. I just thought, oh, well, he's going to be wrong about me, but I'm not going to make any sort of a thing about it, because the truth was that although there were a couple of women writing at Newsweek, one was left over from World War II when all the men had gone to war and they had to use women. And one was a kind of token woman who wrote sort of little short pieces. So I went to work at Newsweek. I was a mail girl, and then I was a clipper, which is just a horrible job, and I was really good at it too, where you had to clip newspapers, and if a cure for cancer were found in St. Louis, you delivered that little clip to the medicine department. That's what you used your brains for. And then I became a researcher. The men were writers and the women were researchers, and that really meant you were a fact checker. They did all their work, and then you underlined it if it was factually correct. Well, I was still pretty happy because it was December the year I graduated from college, and that wasn't a terrible job. And then the newspaper strike started. Of course, it wasn't a newspaper strike. It was the famous 114-day newspaper strike, but actually it was a lockout. The union didn't strike. The publishers couldn't reach a deal with the union, so they shut down the newspapers.
And there were 7 newspapers at the time.
7 New York newspapers.
Dailies.
And I was by then friends with a man named Victor Navasky, who became the publisher of The Nation magazine and had a long career in journalism. But at the time, he was the publisher of a little humor magazine called Monocle, which he called a sporadical because it really almost never came out. But it had, Victor was a person who collected writers and funny writers, and he had a lot of parties, and we all got to know each other, and that's where I met Calvin Trillin and a variety of other people who were all in the nexus of Monocle. And one day Victor called up and he said, I just got $10,000 to publish parodies of the New York newspapers. This is in about late January.
So the strike has been on for about a month.
The strike has been on for a month. Everyone is going crazy. There are no, plays are closing because they couldn't get reviewed when they opened. I mean, it's a devastating thing. And Victor got $10,000 from Arthur Fromer, whose name you may know because he originally wrote Europe on $5 a Day, which is now the Fromer Guide. And Victor said, write a parody of Leonard Lyon's gossip column in the New York Post. And I said, great. And I hadn't really studied Leonard Lyons' gossip column or really read it that carefully. Leonard Lyons was a real fixture in New York. He was about 100, and he'd been writing this column for so long you just couldn't imagine. And he would go to Sardi's every night with his little notebook, and he would go from table to table, and people would give him little items for his column. So I called up a friend of mine who I knew Leonard Lyons because she had babysat his son's dogs. And I said, what's the deal about Leonard Lyons? And she said, the deal is that it's all little stories that have no payoff at all. I mean, it was just, it was the beginning of an anecdote that just expired because he never, ever got the joke or the point or anything. So I read a whole bunch of his columns in the morgue at Newsweek. This is one of the great reasons why we all fall in love with journalism is the morgue.
That's right.
Now there isn't anything like it, but then it was this room with these 5 older people who had spent their lives clipping newspapers and putting the clips into little envelopes that were just yellowing with age. And anyway, I pulled out all the Leonard Lyons columns and I read them, and I had this thing happen that I've written, I don't know, 8 or 10 parodies in my life. And you have to just immerse yourself in the thing, and then suddenly you have it. You absolutely have it, and you write it in some kind of trance. It's very fast writing. You can often write it in 12 minutes. And I just wrote it, and I knew it was funny. The most hilarious thing about them, the most famous thing, is a headline that we didn't use on the New York Post because Victor lost his nerve. The New York Post was a famous bleeding heart liberal newspaper. And the headline was, "Cold Wave Hits New York, Jews, Negroes Suffer Most." But anyway, the point is, it was kind of famous for about a week, and the editors of the New York Post wanted to sue Victor for what? I don't know. And Dorothy Schiff, this kind of ditzy lady who owned the paper, said, don't be idiots. If they can parody the Post, they can write for it. And I got a tryout as a reporter for the New York Post, and that's how I got my job there.